me Guyana, land of many waters with 6 races living together.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion, with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building. Globespan believes that every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diasporas and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana.
Coffee and Dr. Jagan, Bobby, she gave us our great sons. Rohan Kanhai, Coffee and Dr. Jagan.
As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adopt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
Land of many waters with 6 races living together.
Good evening to all our listeners far and wide, and welcome to Globespan Television 24/7 here in New York. Tonight, our program has been made available by Mr. Noor Singh and our technical directors, Mr. Devin Kisoon and Mr. Ryan Gobin. We must thank all our sponsors and our listeners for tuning in to us tonight. And the views and opinions expressed by our guests do not reflect the staff and management of Globespan Television. So tonight we have with us the former Chief Executive Officer of Guyana Power and Light, Mr. Colin Welch. Mr. Welch, good evening to you, sir.
Well, a pleasant good evening to you, Dr. Rose. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic.
And I want our listeners to know that you can tune into Facebook and YouTube to connect to us here. So, Mr. Welch, again, we want to talk about the power failures, the problems with GPL in Guyana. And there's been a problem for the longest while, going back to, I guess, the 70s. And every government that came into office have said that they will end the power blackouts or the power outages in Guyana. And so far, that has not happened. But let me ask you the first question. Let me ask you this first. Can you give us a background of yourself so that our listeners can know who you are?
Certainly. I was born in Guyana and immigrated to the United States in my teenage years. Went through the formal education program here in the United States. I attended Purdue University, where I majored in engineering. Upon graduation, I went out into the workforce. I've worked for some of the premier companies in the United States, to name a few: IBM, Texas Instruments, General Motors Corporation, and Eaton Electrical Corporation, serving in a variety of roles in manufacturing, engineering, and operations management. Got postdoctorate degrees, which is an MBA, and I've also got certificates in environmental sustainability from Harvard University, as well as applied business analytics from MIT.
Okay, that's pretty good. Now, let's get to the gist of the problem. Let's talk about power generation in Guyana. Explain what that means and tell us what's happening with the system when it comes to generating power in Guyana.
Well, I think as you correctly started, power generation has been an ongoing issue, going back many decades in Guyana. The crust of the matter around generation is that we have never really had what I would describe as an adequate reserve generation capacity. What that means is that we lack the ability to produce power in excess of what our requirements are. So we're always teetering on exactly what is required, and maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. When you run a power generation that is that lean, for lack of a better term, you run the risk of subjecting yourself to maintenance issues that come up periodically. You run your risk of seasonal demands. You run your risk of several factors. So most utilities in the world would have what's known as a reserve capacity, which means that if there is any unforeseen circumstance, you have the ability to fire up that reserve and continue going. So in Guyana's case, we've had a limited ability of that cushion going forward.
Okay, now let me ask you this question. You are the former CEO of GPL. Did you resign or you were asked to resign?
Well, when the government changed in 2015, it was made that the new government at that time, which would be the APNU government, they wanted to bring in their own CEO. So it was a mixture of the desire to them do what they want, and also for me to move on to, better and greater and better things for myself.
Okay. So you were actually asked to resign.
That is correct. It was a mutual decision.
Okay. Now, one of the things that people don't understand, or listeners and Guyanese don't understand, is the distribution of power. We have what is called commercial and residential. Explain the commercial aspect of the distribution of power and then the residential aspect of it.
Okay. Well, first, let me start with giving some background on the overall demand. Currently, from a generation standpoint, there is a peak demand in Guyana that ranges anywhere from, I would say, 180 megawatts to something excess of that. The dilemma is the current situation extends to where the company is only able to produce about 160 megawatts. So that leaves a shortfall of anywhere between 15 and 20%. Okay. And that applies across the board to commercial customers, to residential customers, to industrial customers, in that sense. Overall, Guyana has about 227,000 accounts or customer base. 91% of that is residential, 8% would be deemed commercial, and 1% or less than 1% currently would be industrial. Industrial customers would be factories, farms, manufacturers, or things of that nature. Commercial operators would be hotels, and obviously residential customers would be private citizens owning homes.
You're telling our listeners that Guyana's demand for energy is about 180 megawatts, but the company GPL can only produce 160. So my next question to you is this: were there any steps taken to boost the power system to reach or surpass the 180 megawatts? And how can you have 160? This means you'll have rotating blackouts in order to maintain the power grid in Guyana. Am I right?
That is correct. Anytime you produce, your demand calls for something in excess of what you're able to produce, you're currently in a blackout situation or a rolling blackout situation.
Why is it that we could not have produced the 180 megawatts or more than that was needed? What's the reason for that?
Well, there would be several reasonings. One, if you look at the factors that go into addressing the demand, you have new housing schemes coming on stream. You have what I would call unusually hot weather, which is the climate driven with folks utilizing more AC. You have the industrial or commercial customers and increase in that customer base that's coming online. You have perhaps some of the self-generators, such as the Wright Farmers, Banks DIH, Bihari Limited. All those folks are self-generators. Perhaps they're wanting to come on the grid. So there needs to be a concerted effort to manage that. And if you look at the GPL demand and development and expansion plan, you would see that those requirements were identified. So now to answer your question, if you identify those requirements, why isn't there adequate planning to keep in line with the demand? And that has always been a struggle, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, with GPL, which is generating that reserve capacity that's needed. So it's not a surprise that we are in this predicament. It's something that we're seeing, something that was forecasted, but yet we find ourselves in this predicament.
Okay, let me just go back to this question. GPL has been unable to generate the required power needed for Guyana, but there are a lot of private companies that are using generators. So that should lower the demand from 180, maybe 150, 160, I don't know. So am I right to say that?
No, that's not a correct assessment. The 160 was being viewed separately from the self-generators. What the self-generators are relying on is GPL increasing its power requirements, expanding the generation capacity, and that would invite them or give them encouragement to be invited to join the grid. So that's the self-generators are separate from what's being utilized currently.
During your tenure, was there proper maintenance done to GPL? And do you think that maintenance is being continued today?
Well, I come from a quality background, so I was adequately trained from an operations standpoint to look at those requirements specifically. There are, just to give you an example, there were times when that cable that stretches from Wiedenhoop across to Kingston Station, when there would be concerns about ships navigating the Demerara River and snagging that cable. Now, that cable isn't a permanently buried cable, so it's always exposed to that phenomena. So at least once a quarter, it needs to be divers going down into the Demerara River and assessing the condition of that cable. And if there is a concern where the cable is starting to elevate from the surface, then you need to rebury it. So that's thinking ahead, planning for contingencies, and addressing the problem ahead of time. Now, to your question, has there been that kind of discipline? After I departed GPL, I couldn't address that. But I can tell you that kind of discipline is required not only in the example that I gave you, but across the board. When it comes to the generators, maintenance system. If you think in terms of your automobile, you have to take your car in for service, every so few thousand miles, let's say, to get your oil change and do that kind of maintenance. Well, it's no different for a generator. Every so often, those generators have to be taken down and maintained, and then put back into service. The question you're asking me, if that was adequately addressed after I departed, then I couldn't address that. But I would tell you, based on what I've been able to identify recently, looking at GPL's current condition, where they're able to produce an availability of 160 megawatts, there are detractors from that. We're looking at, as we speak during this conversation, there are two gensets or two engines at the Kingston facility that are down for maintenance. We're looking at the Skeldon facility, which was brought on board to produce 10 megawatts. At best, particularly during my tenure, that was only able to produce about 2 megawatts per se. You're looking at Canefield and Enverwalk facilities, which has always had issues with the capacity to generate power because of those aged units at those facilities. You're looking at Columbia, where there was an installed capacity of about 28 megawatts, and only 19 of that is available currently. So these are the ongoing issues that take away from that put you at a greater deficit from the 160 that's being applied. So it's really exacerbating a bad situation.
Let me ask you this question. I'm not sure if you know it, but if you don't know, you can say you don't know. Are there similar problems in other Caribbean countries in terms of generation of power? Do you know?
Well, I would say Guyana is unique in the sense that we have never really operated with an excess reserve capacity. As I mentioned earlier, typically in power utilities across the board, not only in the Caribbean, utilities tend to cater between 20 and 50% of reserve capacity. We basically may have, maybe 1 or 2% at best. And then when you're faced with these maintenance issues, it certainly detracts from that.
Mr. Welch, when you were the CEO for GPL, you said Guyana never had excess reserve capacity. Did you try to implement something like that so as to boost the power system in Guyana?
That is always an ongoing struggle. During my tenure, when those issues were elevated to the power that be, it typically, to be honest with you, would require some degree of desperation. And what I mean by that, you're looking at entities within the governing structure that have competing interests. The healthcare industry, as an example, may require certain resources to function. There are other utilities in Guyana that may require resources to function. GPL, if GPL isn't in a crisis situation, meaning that that they're not experiencing ongoing blackouts, then it's certainly a situation where the squeaky wheel gets the oil, let's say. So it was always my position, let's say, to push the issue to where contingency plans took effect. When you look at what was being forecasted in terms of not only generation, but other areas of the utility, you certainly found the need to get those programs on stream and going. But again, you have to recognize that there are competing interests. GPL isn't the only government institution there in the company. So there are competing interests, let's say, that requires resources, and force above me would have to make those decisions.
Now, you're highly qualified, and you knew GPL system, I should say, almost inside out. What is your best assessment of the company for the numerous power blackouts we're having now in Guyana? What do you think are the main reasons or the main causes for them?
Well, first we absolutely have to address the generation situation. I read recently that there have been moves to get a floating generation station from Qatar of about 36 megawatts to come in to Guyana there and let's say supplement what's or augment, I should say, the current capacity, generation capacity there. If you were to bring in 36 capacity today, I mean, from what I read, it seems like it's 3 weeks away. But if that were to arrive even today, they still would be a deficit in power generation. So in my estimation, the powers that be needs to go even further in terms of augmenting that capacity. 36, an increase of 36 megawatts is not sufficient to stem let's say, the current discomfort that country associated with the blackouts.
How much you think is required to stem the power blackouts?
It needs to at least double that. If you're going to bring in an additional 36, double that to 72. And you have to keep in mind too that it's only going to get worse. The demand for power wouldn't decrease. It would only increase, particularly at this stage of development that the country's in. I mean, you've got suppliers that are coming into the country that's associated with the oil and gas projects that's occurring. You've got folks in the country who are finding themselves to install, let's say, ACs. And ACs is a huge power consumption there in the country. And rightfully so, folks should. If you're able to afford an AC unit, particularly with the unseasonably hot weather, then certainly you should do so. That's no surprise to the power company. They've seen that forecast being generated for that increased demand. So, though the additional 36 megawatts is a step in the right direction, they certainly need to at least double that.
Now, when we talk about power generation, we have to take into consideration line losses and theft. Line losses due to resistance. What percentage of our power generation are lost in resistance line losses? Do you know?
Losses in general are about, I would say, roughly a third.
Roughly at what?
A third, 1/3.
30%? 33%?
Between 30 and 33%.
Okay.
Okay. So in essence, of the power that's being generated, let's say roughly a third of that is gone due to losses. Of the losses in itself, you're looking at about a 50-50 split between technical losses and commercial losses. Okay. On the technical losses side, as you upgrade the grid, you're able to address that. On the commercial losses side, which is, to put it plainly, theft of electricity, then you need to put programs in place to stem that commercial loss. And I would also say this: if you look at the commercial losses in itself, you can perhaps narrow those commercial losses down to maybe 300 accounts. And those 300 accounts would account for, I would say, 70% of the commercial losses. So if you focus on those 300 accounts, you would be able to, let's say, make significant inroads into your commercial losses. As you upgrade the grid, be it on the transmission system, the distribution system, the SCADA system, you're able to address those technical losses. Those technical losses are basically coming from a very old grid system, and a lot of that old technology needs to be replaced, and which is recognized by the company.
What about theft?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a concerted effort around that. And when it comes to theft, it's basically a combination of, let's say, dishonest customers and to some extent dishonest employees within GPL. When those two work in concert, it becomes a little difficult to combat. So the company itself needs to address internally how employees are contributing to theft, and then secondarily, how the customer base is contributing to theft. One of the things that I had proposed while I was there was basically to have, in the US, we have a system where you don't bog down the legal system with traffic-related occurrences. People with speeding tickets or traffic tickets, it tends to be a separate court for those matters. I had proposed a separate court for electricity theft, but that really didn't get the traction that I thought it deserved.
Now, is your 33% line losses factored into the 160 megawatts being produced?
Well, the generation is separate. When you're looking at the line losses, you're looking at factors on the transmission and distribution side. So what essentially will happen, two things. One, from a financial standpoint, the tariffs in the country needs to be adjusted to compensate the company, let's say, for that degree of losses, because the same requirements are still in play. You still require, whether there are losses or not, you still need to buy fuel, let's say, to run those generators. So that cost gets passed on to the customer base to compensate for that. What needs to be addressed is putting systems in place to upgrade the grid, be it the transmission system, the distribution system there in the country, as well as addressing the theft issue.
Now, to the best of your knowledge and ability, what can be done to prevent such huge line losses?
Well, during my tenure, there was a program called the PUUP program, which was, I think, the Power Utility Upgrade Program, of which I believe there was about $23 million slated to upgrade the infrastructure of the system, which were transmission lines, distribution lines, metering strategies, and things of that nature. In fact, during my tenure, I brought into bear what's known as AMI metering, automatic metering infrastructure, which essentially would put these types of meters in the grid configuration. And with those meters, GPL is able to monitor from a remote location the use. So, for example, if you're sitting in one of the offices there at GPL, you're able to see each account where these meters are installed. And if you look at those, if you monitor those meters adequately, and you see, for example, it went from a certain consumption rate to 0, then you knew something was awry, unless there was a power outage in that given area. Now you've got information to alert you to a potential theft situation, because certainly if there is 0 consumption being read with that particular meter, and you don't have a disruption or a blackout situation, then that warrants an investigation, and it warrants someone physically going out to that location to see physically what's occurring. So they need, with the technology, there needs to be a concerted effort behind going out and addressing the situation as these alarms go out. Now, if you're asking me, has that been occurring at GPL, I can answer that right now. But at my tenure, there was certainly a focus on addressing that.
Mr. Welch, I'm going to talk to you during your tenure. Do you think governments, past and present, are investing wisely in GPL?
Well, I would say there is enough blame to go around, regardless of whatever administration that you may be talking about. Okay, rather than point the finger at this administration versus that administration, what we need to look at is what are the requirements of the nation in terms of power consumption and power distribution. And when we focus when we have a focus with that interest, it removes the political imperatives, and there is a focus then on the customer and the customer requirements in terms of receiving adequate power, reliable power, and sustainable power. So again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, we first need to address the generation issue, okay? Because that is the crust of the matter. Without generation, it doesn't matter what we do, there is going to be, a shortfall in the ability to supply power.
Okay, let's come to management. During your tenure again, did you have an adequate, competent staff, qualified personnel, for example, engineers, technical analysts, technicians, and so forth, during your tenure?
I would say at the lower level, the worker bee level, the folks that are carrying out the daily task, there is a degree of adequacy there. I've often said that GPL's problem is not a lack of engineers, okay, or a lack of competent engineers. The folks at that level are quite competent. Where the struggle with GPL comes in is the leadership capacity. And I will give you an example for training and development. If you look at what I would call a first world utility company, the technologies are always changing. So there is a need for individuals to upgrade their skills, both from a subject matter expertise as well as overall leadership ability. And when I came into GPL, that was woefully lacking. And so there was a concerted effort to join with CAROLIC, and CAROLIC is the Caribbean Community of Utilities organization, and they offer various degrees of training, and to get folks to go out and become adequately trained, not only in their subject matter expertise, but also in their leadership ability. Okay, the performance appraisal process to monitor that also was woefully lacking. You have a situation where, let's say in the normal world, for lack of a better example, lack of a better illustration, where, well, I can speak to myself as an example. When I worked for Eaton Electrical, at the beginning of the year, you sat down with your management and you agree on your training requirements. And let's say you agree on 100 hours of training for that given year. Okay. At the end of the year, when your performance review was conducted, one of the first questions asked, did you go and attend those 100 hours that you agreed to? Right. So you had to account for your own development. And if there was for some reason you fell short on those 100 hours, you had to explain the reason why. And it might have been, an adequate reason why. Maybe there were certain demands within the company that didn't allow you to, or permit you the time to go and what have you. But assuming that your management accepted that, in the very next year that you sat down again with your management structure, you had to make up that deficit. Okay, that kind of structure was not at GPL. So you had individuals who were woefully lacking in their leadership ability, and I would suspect that that still exists today. Okay, because the first question that, or not the first question, but the early question that you asked me was, if this deficit in generation is not a surprise, why didn't we adequately plan for it? Why didn't the company adequately plan for it? And that in itself calls into question the leadership.
I'll come to the leadership later on. Now, after the government, the general consensus is that Gaisuku is the second largest employer in Guyana. But how many people GPL employs, do you know?
During my tenure, it was about 1,200. I'm not sure what the number is today.
1,200 across the country?
Correct.
And which areas are having the most problems with during your tenure? Essequibo, Demerara, or Berbice?
Well, Guyana is segmented into, let's say, two grids. There is the Demerara Berbice interconnection or interconnected grid, and then there's the what was referred to as the isolated grid, which was Essequibo. Essequibo certainly is the smaller of the two. Essequibo is probably about 23 megawatts versus the 180 that's required there in Demerara and Berbice. Essequibo tend to be more self-sufficient, and if they were an issue in Essequibo, it was easier to address based on just the size of the requirements there, of the grid requirements there. In Demerara and Berbice, it was a little different. And there are several factors that are associated with that. From a transmission standpoint, there's power from Demerara that has to be transmitted up to Berbice due to the deficit of generation capacity. As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, the power station at Anvawak continually struggled because there was old equipment. They're old generators. In fact, I believe that facility at Anvawak still has General Motors gensets, and General Motors has been out of the gensets business for decades now. So those units are way past their useful life. They're similar gensets at Kane Field, such as the Merle, that they're way past their generation life. So if I had to, just based on that type of information, certainly Demerara is in a better position than Berbice in terms of its ability to produce power. The power stations in Demerara tend to be newer. There was a 46 megawatt recently injected into the Garden of Eden. There was the 26 megawatt that was injected during my tenure in Wiedenhoop. The stations in Kingston tend to be newer than those other facilities in Berbice.
Let me play the devil's advocate here. Maybe I'm ignorant of the fact. Can we get 100 megawatts in generating system from a generator? Is that possible? Does that exist?
It does exist, but it calls into question the grid integrity. If you were to bring 100 megawatts into Guyana today, let's say some entity just freely gave 100 megawatts to relieve the blackout situation, we couldn't accept that. And we couldn't accept it based on the grid configuration. There is if you look at the transmission capability, there is the older Patridge line that can only accept about 34 megawatts. Then you have what we call the Canton lines, the Canton transmission lines that can only accept maybe 70 megawatts. So as you go out to bring additional power in, you have to take that into account. Be able to accept. So that's one of the reasons you see the flotilla that's being brought to Guyana in the next 3 weeks to be about 34, 36 megawatts, because where it's targeted to be installed, those lines can only accept 34 megawatts.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question here, and it came from one of our listeners. I don't know how true it is, but she is from the quarantine. She says when there's a power outage in the quarantine, it will start from actually Wim and go all the way to Skeldon. And then if there's one from the Amsterdam, it will come all the way just before Wim or something. Is that true? And if so, why such a large section has to be in blackout at any one time?
That's because the way the grid is configured. The best way to explain that is if there is a fault anywhere along the lines, particularly the transmission lines, and that fault makes its way back to a power station, there is a chain reaction. And that chain reaction is one such that if a power station is knocked out, then the remaining power station in existence is then forced to supplement that one station that's being out of commission due to that fault. Okay, so there is a protection mechanism for the generation systems that says shut all the systems down to protect them, because you don't want to have a situation where you're blowing an engine at another, let's say, location. So to use your example there, if the fault knocked out Anvoak, and then Canefield is forced to supplement that power, then Canefield can't do that without causing damage to the Canefield facility. So the Canefield then goes down, okay? And then maybe other engines would go down, such that you address the problem that caused the fault, and then you bring all the engines back up. So that's why you see a situation where there's a particular fault, the country goes down, and then maybe a few moments or some time period afterwards, and the country come back up. And they had a phenomenon that was called, the people rightfully called it the fairy lights phenomena, which meant that the entire country went down. You try to bring it back up, but you didn't correct the problem, or the problem wasn't sufficiently corrected. And when you try to bring the power back up, and the problem is not sufficiently corrected, then it goes back down again until it's addressed.
I have another question from one of our listeners, and he asked me to mention his name. He's Mr. Hardat Ramlochan, and he's from the quarantine. He says, from Amsterdam to Skeldon, it's about roughly, according to him, 55 to 60 miles. Mm-hmm. He said he's also technical, but he didn't mention what he's in. He wants to know why can't we have four power generating systems of the quarantine.
Hey, Dr. Rose?
Yeah,
can you hear me?
I'm hearing you.
Yeah. Yeah, you were breaking up when you were stating that question. Do you mind repeating it?
Ryan, I'm having some feedback.
Hello?
Yeah, just a second. Ryan?
Yes, Dr.
I'm having some feedback.
One second.
I think no, not
no,
good.
not good.
Am I good
Am
to
I
go?
good to go?
No.
No.
Having the
Having the
feedback.
feedback.
Mr. Welch,
Mr. Welch.
Hello?
Hello?
can you
Can you
rejoin the call?
rejoin the call?
We
We
still have
still
having the
having a
feedback.
feedback.
How is it going? I think I'm good now, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yes. Let me repeat the question. One, Mr. Hart at Ramlochan asked me the question. He said, between New Amsterdam and Skeldon. You hearing me loudly clear now, Mr. Welch?
Dr. Rose,
Yes.
he now rejoined. Right, okay, good.
Yeah, Mr. Welch, you hearing me now?
Yeah, much better, much better.
Okay. One, Mr. Ramlochan asked me to ask you this question. And he's from the quarantine, he says between New Amsterdam and Skeldon is about 50 to 60 miles.
That's correct.
So why is it there can't be at least 4 major power generating systems spread out equally with mileage? In other words, if it's 4, it's about 13 miles apart. So that if one section goes down, only that section of 13 miles will go down and not half of the quarantine or one way or the other. Is that possible? To have 4 major generating systems from New Amsterdam to Skeldon?
And the short answer to that, yeah, it's possible. The question then becomes, is it practical? Because when you look at locations for generation systems, there are several factors that take into play. One of the major factors is the power that's being required in that given area. So you don't want to put a power station in an area where the power isn't adequately needed, let's say, in that particular area, because it then would have to travel quite a long distance to where it's needed. So I'm not sure if, every 13 miles, as the listener is saying, would be the optimal solution to address that. But you have to, and that's been one of the issues with the country in itself, where you're constantly rebalancing the grid. When you look at putting a power station in a new location, there are several factors that go into, is this the ideal location based on the requirements, based on the power requirements? So you tend to put that station in the center of where the demand is, or where most of the demand is. So it doesn't have to travel a distance to do that. In the current configuration of GPL, you may have power that's being generated in Wiedenhoop. It's being sent all the way up to Berbice based on the shortfall that's occurring in Berbice. Now that's not the optimal situation, but certainly if there is a need to address the shortfall in Berbice and power from Wiedenhoop is available to do so, then obviously you would do that.
Do you think we need to build a brand new plant and move it away from Kingston?
Well, in my view, Kingston is an ideal location. I mean, that's the center of the demand. You've got a good mixture of residential and commercial requirements, and maybe even industrial customers. So Kingston has always been an ideal location. So I wouldn't suggest moving away from Kingston. If anything, I would say augmenting the Kingston location.
Okay. Now, let's go back to leadership. What does GPL has good leadership, and what type of leadership is needed in GPL, do you think?
Well, certainly folks with first and foremost the customer interest at heart. Now, I'm not suggesting that the leadership doesn't have the customer interest at heart, but that's first and foremost that's needed. Secondly, understanding the requirements of your customer base. Okay. And by that, I mean paying close attention to the needs, particularly from a forecast standpoint. And I would invite all the listeners on this broadcast to go and review GPL's D&E plan, which is a development and expansion plan, where the company clearly explains what the future focus is. And the most recent D&E is it's labeled 2023 to, I believe, 2028, because it's a 5-year plan. And if you look at that plan and you read it, you start to have a better appreciation for what the company needs to do versus what was actually done. And that gap is immediately identified, and you have a better appreciation for the dilemma that we find ourselves in.
If you don't mind, another of our listener chime in here again. And she is saying, because she's a she, why is electricity more expensive in Guyana than in the Eastern Caribbean, where she's living?
Well, for starters, as I mentioned earlier, the losses in Guyana, both commercial and technical combined, is about a third, roughly about a third. Okay, so the paying public, the paying customer base has to compensate for that. So the tariffs or the rates in electricity has to take that into account. So the tariffs right now in Guyana is roughly between 28 to 30 cents US cents kilowatt hour. That is prohibitively high. You know, in other parts of the world, maybe where that listener is calling from, it might be anywhere between 6 to maybe 15 cents a kilowatt hour.
So why is this so high in Guyana?
Because of the losses.
But are those countries experience losses too? I don't know if you know that. No?
I don't know that, but I would tell you a 30% loss is extremely high.
Okay, now we talk about the expansion, the economic boom and so forth. But it appears to me that governments are lagging behind these expansions. Why is it that the government, when they're giving out more houses, more development and so forth, they cannot spend more money on the electrical system to meet those demands? Why is it taking them so long to do?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, prior to the development of the oil industry, there was always these competing interests, and the government of the day had to balance between the priorities of the nation. Power generation certainly is a priority, but then there are others. It may be the healthcare industry. It might be other utilities. It might be, infrastructure such as building roads and those types of things that require funds to develop the nation. Yeah. As a person specifically assigned to GPL, certainly I would be concerned about GPL's needs, but I cannot speak to the healthcare of the country. The powers that be would have to speak to that and then make the decision, which of the two is more important, let's say, based on the scarcity of the resources or the funds available to address it. I would say now that we're into this oil or economic boom, that has certainly changed those dynamics. Okay. Prior to the oil coming on stream, the GDP in Guyana was about $5,000 per capita. And I understand, per capita is not the end all to be all of indicators. But just using that roughly as a guide, today the GDP in Guyana is 20,000 US dollars per capita. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that each household in Guyana is making 20,000 US dollars, but based on the infusion of cash and economic growth, when you do the numbers across the board, it certainly speaks to an increase in GDP. Now, if that increase in GDP is filtering down to the people that are most affected by it, that remains an open question, and people above me would have to address that.
Power blackouts in Guyana and any part of the world is an annoyance, and it disrupts the lives of people. Because in Guyana, for instance, if there's a power blackout, there's no water. Because the water system, the generating pumps of the water system depend on the power and so forth. But Mr. Wells, let me put you on the spot. And normally I don't put our guests on the spot too often. I don't.
Okay.
I very seldom do that. I'm telling the truth.
Well, go for it. Go for it.
Based on what I read about your background and your experience, you are a highly qualified person. This is in conjunction with your experience in North America and other countries that where you've been working. If given the opportunity to become the CEO for GPL once again, what would be your first action to stem the power blackouts in Guyana?
Well, first, I appreciate the question. Secondly, I remain committed to serving Guyana in whatever capacity I can. Okay. To address your specific question, in terms of the first actions required, again, I have to go back to generation. Generation is the root of the evil, for lack of a better term, that plagues the country. Okay. And if you look at utilities across the world, it starts with generation. Okay. And having what I described earlier as that reserve capacity to cater to, anticipated as well as unanticipated disruptions. Okay. We are arguably at a peak demand of between, let's say, in excess of 180, because the peak demand can be a tricky analysis. Okay. So for argument's sake, let's say we're at a peak demand between 180 and 120. And we have an available capacity of 160. It becomes a non-brainer. That tells us we need to install more generation capacity. Okay. I think the current dilemma is we're looking at a gas to energy program that's coming on stream to generate about 300 megawatts. And we're looking at our current dilemma in a deficit of where we stand today of at least 36 megawatts worth of energy. And we're saying to ourselves, well, what is the least amount of effort to bridge the current gap while we wait on the 300 megawatt of energy to come on stream? And that becomes a very tricky dilemma. If the question was asked of me, I would say, go ahead, full steam ahead, and install the additional capacity required. So if there's 36 megawatts coming on stream in the next 3 weeks, it really needs to be 72 or some number greater than that.
If the gas to shore project, as anticipated, will generate 300 megawatts of power, and the government is telling us that it will reduce electricity, by how much I do not know, but it will reduce electricity. Do you think it will?
Yes, I mean,
I'm talking about the cost of electricity for the average household.
When you bring that available generation capacity on stream, okay, and in this case, the example that you're telling me is 300 megawatts, that would go a long way in addressing the current shortfall. Okay, one. Two, you have to look at the cost of production, and the cost of production would significantly drop. I believe that the cost of production right now at GPL is perhaps maybe anywhere between 21, 22 cents per megawatt hour. Okay, and that's just the production cost of power. Okay, when the gas to energy comes on stream, I'm not sure what the numbers would be, but it would be significantly less than those 22 cents. So there is going to be an expectation that the rates go down. Okay, what they go down to would depend on what the powers that be at that time figure that it should be. If you ask me, I would say it can go down anywhere between 10 to 15 cents per megawatt hour, which is a significant reduction.
Okay. Now, let's talk about alternative energy system, wind and solar. Do you think the government should embark on projects to get more solar energy in the country and more wind energy?
Well, you mentioned wind and solar. Wind, I would put at perhaps a lower priority. There is, if you were today to install a wind generation capacity, you stand the risk of bringing that entire grid down, because wind is a tricky proposition. There is wind, obviously, is when the wind is blowing, is when the generation occurs. So when the wind is not blowing at that required velocity, you're not generating. But you have to have a grid that's capable of receiving those swings in the generation capacity. Today, the grid in Guyana cannot tolerate those swings. Those swings would bring that entire grid down. So wind is a long shot. Solar is a better alternative. And in fact, I would not only mention solar, obviously there's the hydro ability. I mean, we're the land of many waters, and certainly we don't take advantage of that ability. The Amila Falls project that was slated to bring 165 megawatts on stream, in my view, should have been on stream. That project should have gone forward, even if there were anxieties about the cost, because what we're faced with today with our blackout situation far exceeds the cost of what the Amila project would have been. Okay, there is the solar is not an adequate base load. Okay, because obviously, it's dependent on the sun, and when the sun is not cooperating with us as it should, then those go away unless you have an expensive reserve energy, which would be in the form of battery storage ability. capability. And even if you have a reserve battery storage ability, you're still limited to the number of days that storage is required to lost. Not lost, but required to be utilized, rather. Okay, so if the sun is cooperating, and Guyana is in a solar sensitive location, which means we would expect the sun to be cooperating at least 85% of the time, then that's the go. Okay, but I would certainly focus my attention on hydro and solar power. Wind, I would put that further down on the list.
So you think the government should, as the government is trying to do at the moment, try to resurrect the Amelia Falls project? So you think that's a good plan?
Certainly. You have 106. If the number stays consistent with when the plan was initially introduced, and I believe that was 165 megawatts, and you couple that with the 300 megawatts of energy from the gas to energy program, it certainly dwarfs what we currently do today. Yeah.
Okay. Now, all this will cost a lot of money, as you know. Is GPL a profitable organization? During your tenure?
Well, that question of itself is an oxymoron. And I say that because GPL is a government-funded institution. Okay, and it's not like a private institution that has to be responsible for their profit and loss statement. So, as a government-funded institution, if there is any shortfall, then obviously you go back to the government from a budgetary standpoint to make up for that shortfall. And most private businesses don't have that, let's say, advantage. You know, if you have a private business and you're not profitable, then you've got to find ways to raise capital or go out of business. GPL is not in that predicament. So what GPL has to focus on is operational efficiencies. You know, bring the cost of production down. Rely less on the infusion of cash from the government, and that would make it a self-sustaining entity. And that goes along not only with GPL, but I would say any governmental institution in Guyana, be it GWI or whatever the case might be. Okay, but again, that goes back to your question of leadership. You have to have the right leaders in place to affect that kind of profit and loss integrity.
From your training, knowledge, and experience, can GPL become profitable? What can be done to make GPL profitable?
You know, I will take you back historically to when GPL, maybe your listeners don't really realize that, but GPL at once upon a time was a private business. There was an entity, I believe, out of Ireland or Scotland, can't remember where they're from, that came into to Guyana and assumed the bought into the company. It was a private company at that time, acquired GPL, and that company functioned, I believe, for about 3 to 5 years. And it was determined by that company that based on the challenges at that time with GPL, that they weren't going to be profitable, and they sold GPL back to the government for $1. So that's indicative of the challenges that's surrounding GPL. Uniquely in all of this, we have never had a situation where there was an industry such as the oil and gas industry that's producing that kind of funding to help supplement, one, the budget of GPL, and two, put an infrastructure in place, be it advances in generation, advances in transmission, advances in distribution, to lower the overall operating costs. Because if you think of it in terms of being able to address the generation shortfall, being able to address the infrastructural shortfall in terms of transmission and distribution, being able to address the losses, be it commercial and technical, then certainly the elements to make GPL a profitable company exist.
I want to come back to the profitability of GPL. You said during your tenure you had about 1,200 employees. Let's say now there are 2,000 employees. In Guyana, the estimated amount of households is about 310,000. That's a large clientele. And I think almost 95% of them depend on GPL for their energy. So why can't GPL be profitable? Does it have to increase the rates to be profitable? Maintain the rates? What's the reason it can't?
I'm not. GPL can in fact be profitable. It takes the right leadership and the right circumstances to become profitable. One of the most important factors there is the cost of production. Okay, GPL today, 95% of the cost, well, actually it's about 85% of the cost is centered around fuel and being able to purchase the heavy fuel oil, the HFO, as well as the LFO, which is to a lesser extent. Now, if you look at the two fuel requirements, particularly for Demerara and Berbice, 95% of the fuel cost is attributed to HFO. 5% would be, LFO, which is diesel fuel oil. Okay. So if you're able to develop alternatives such as hydro, which would be a far significantly lesser cost, which would be the gas to energy project, would be a far less effective cost of production. You put yourself in a significant vantage point where you're able to address your profitability.
Now, you spoke about right leadership. Can you explain that, what it means to our listeners?
Having the right leadership in place starts from a top-down effect. And what I mean by that, you have the CEO, let's say, of the company that's accountable for the performance. And based on his requirements or his targets or his objectives, rather, that needs to be filtered down to the lowest level of the organization. So what I mean by that, and not disparaging any particular function within your organization, but for the guy that's digging a hole to plant poles in the country, he needs to understand exactly how his efforts are contributing to the overall profitability of the company, an overall function of the company. And he's not thinking that, he's just digging a hole to plant a pole. Okay? That kind of leadership needs to be instilled in the organization to where all levels of the organization understand the role that they play and the contributing effort of that role to the organization. In today's environment, at least certainly in the environment that I was in when I was there, that was a struggle. Folks just didn't understand that. They look at their roles as an isolated pocket of occurrences. Okay, in the modern world in the utility, that's not the case. I mean, it's understood what your role is. It's understood what your contribution should be based on your performance goals and your appraisal process. And all that is tied back into the functionality of the company.
So you're saying that retraining of the employees is needed?
Greatly needed.
But was this any retraining done during your time and prior to your time?
Absolutely. In fact, I personally participated in that training process in GPL's existence, at least as far as I know. I personally instituted a program known as business ethics, where particularly all new employees coming into the company needed to be trained on the virtues of business ethics and efficacy that's required. And I would conduct those training myself personally, rather than bringing a consultant in to do that. And you know, I'll give you a flavor for how that training went. You probably get a kick out of this. I would, in that training process, I would put forth the principles in ethics. And ethics, as you may know, Dr. Rose, that's a personal thing. You know, you get your personal ethics from, from the leaders in your life, be it your school teachers, your religious leaders, and so forth. Form your parents, your upbringing. Those all form the basis of your personal ethics. Okay. In the same accord, there is business ethics that might be slightly different than your personal ethics, but nonetheless, a business has ethics and guidelines that they should follow. So I would conduct this training, and I would always get to the point in the training where I would ask the participants that if they were to go out to a let's say a new installation, and they conducted that process adequately on a new account, and that customer at that location offered the employee, let's say, cash as an incentive or an appreciation for the work that was done. And again, this is not the employee soliciting that cash. This is the customer, through, I guess, the kindness or the generosity of their heart, offering this to the employee. And the question was asked, should the employee accept that? Well, 10 out of 10 times, the employee said yes. They would accept it. It's not something they solicited, something that the customer offered, so why not? Okay. And I would often reboot that with, no, you shouldn't, because the only place in GPL where cash is exchanged or payment is exchanged is in the commercial office, where someone is paying their bill or paying for capital infrastructure, whatever the case might be. Okay, there is no other place in GPL where cash should be exchanged. Okay, and that was a struggle for those employees to understand, because again, they didn't solicit any cash. This was purely out of the kindness of the heart of the customer. And my premise of explaining to them as to why they shouldn't accept it is that if for any reason that there is a disagreement down the line between them and the customer, and that customer comes into me and says, back a few months ago, or whenever the case might be, I paid this employee on the side, this cash incentive, I would view that as the employee being compromised. Okay. And in that sense, the employment status of the employee comes into question. So to protect themselves against that, I often said, even if you haven't solicited, okay, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, you haven't solicited this cash payment, it was out of the kindness of the customer that put that forth. You should still say thanks, but no thanks, and move on. Okay? That's the kind of training I'm talking about that's required in the country. That's the kind of training that changed the behavior of a nation. It starts off with a very small pocket of individual, but slowly extends beyond that immediate entity and beyond and into the greater populace.
Mr. Welch, you've been doing an excellent job in explaining the nuts and bolts of GPL, and that's very, very good. But I have another question for you. As you know, and all of us know, politics affects everyone's life and everything in every country. How does politics affect the role and function of GPL in Guyana?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there is enough blame to go around with whatever persuasion of politics you have in the country. Okay? What needs to be done is set aside the political atmosphere. At the end of the day, we're all customers paying for a service. And the service that we're paying for is when we enter our homes or our businesses and we hit that switch, that light switch, we expect the lights to come on, irregardless of the politics. Okay? And when that light doesn't come on, it affects us all equally, regardless of your political persuasion. Okay? So, regardless of the brand of politics that's in place at the time, okay, there needs to be a focus on the customer. And that customer should be receiving power in a reliable and sustainable fashion, regardless of the politics.
Let me come back to a question. Give me your experience, knowledge, and training. Do you think there's light at the end of the tunnel for GPL to reduce or end blackouts totally?
Yeah, I mean, unquestionably that exists. I mean, we as a nation, I mean, it's not our misfortune or bad luck that we are in this this blackout crisis. Okay, it's been done the world over. Okay, so again, it takes the right amount of focus and resources, and it starts with generation. Okay, we can, in short order, increase the generation availability in the country. Okay, that opportunity exists. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we're producing about 160 megawatts. Very easily, we can increase that to, let's say, 250. Okay, we have the funds available in the country to do that. Okay, I mentioned earlier, we've gone from a GDP from, you know, $5,000 to $20,000. So for the first time in Guyana's history, those funds are available. Okay. What I think the current powers that be is groveling with is, do they put that investment in place now versus waiting until this oil and gas initiative comes on stream, meaning the 300 megawatt facility comes on stream. And my advice would be to spend the money wisely now in the interim to stem the blackout gaps. Because as I look at what's required for that to come on stream, as I mentioned earlier, I worked for Eaton Corporation, Eaton Electrical, and the kinds of equipment that's required in both the power plant as well as the refinery plant are produced by Eaton. So I'm very familiar with those, with that type of equipment. And there's only a handful of companies in the world that produce those types of equipment. Okay, it's ABB, Eaton Corporation, as I've worked for. There's Siemens, Schneider Electric, and the world has to go to those companies for that type of equipment. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, it created a significant backlog in those types of in the ability to produce those type of equipment. So all of those companies are faced with overcoming a backlog. Okay, if you look across the board of the timeline that's required to put that kind of a facility in place, there's a minimum of 3 years from start to finish. Okay, or from start to commissioning that's required, and that's assuming that we hit a home run every step of the way. Okay. In Guyana, we're not known for hitting home runs in project management. Okay, that's just the reality of it. Okay? That gas to energy project was awarded, I believe, at the end of 2022. Okay, 3 years later would put us at the end of 2025. And again, that's if we hit a home run along the way. And those companies that produce those type of equipment, they're in a deficit from the pandemic. So it would take them a little longer than 3 years to produce that kind of equipment. What would place the project management a little longer. So if you ask me when the gas to energy would be up and running, I would put that at the end of 2026 at best. Okay.
Okay.
So
Now,
that's another 2 years.
okay. Now, we come into the end of the program, but I have a final question for you here from a listener. He wants to know if the plant at Kingston provides electricity to Vorbees and its equivalent.
The short answer is yes. Once you have the infrastructure in place, you can send the power from any location to any other location in the grid.
So here is this real question. He says, if the answer is yes, then why can't we have 3 plants like those? One in Vorbees and one in Essequibo and one in Guyana and one in Demerara. That's the question for one of our listeners. I don't know the answer. You're laughing.
Well, the answer is yes, but at what cost? Okay, you can replicate the Kingston plant, and Kingston has was that 24 plus 26. Kingston has a significant amount of power there. So if the answer is if what the listener is asking is, can you pick up in excess of 50 megawatts in Kingston and replicate that in Berbice, you could do it. Yeah, you could do it. But at what cost and at what benefit? So that kind of cost analysis would need to be conducted to make sense. But there are certainly things that we can do that would be less prohibitive in terms of costs that can get us there. That floating unit coming from Qatar in the next 3 weeks is certainly a less expensive criteria. And we can very easily bring another one. Okay, I don't see any limitations from the government perspective. Now, there might be some challenges in terms of connecting that to the grid, and we've got to take that into account. From a technical standpoint, and not to be too technical in that nature, in this discussion, but there are certain things in the grid that we would have to do, certain challenges, I would say, to make that interconnectivity feasible in short order.
So can we use that 36 megawatt from Qatar in another county, let's say as Essequibo or Berbice?
We can station that anywhere we want to, providing that there's space to do that. Okay, it can be in Berbice, it can be in them, it can be along the coast in Demerara, it can be wherever it makes it feasible to connect to the grid.
Okay. Mr. Welch, we have come to the end of the program, but your answers have been so enlightened. I hope our listeners learned a lot, and there are many of them who tuned in and were listening to you, because blackouts, they claim, affect everybody in Guyana. You have done a marvelous job, I must tell you that. Now, let me ask you
Okay.
your closing remarks. I have to bring you back at another time, though, but your closing remarks.
The overarching dilemma of GPL is not restricted to GPL. The need for an adequate power supply extends beyond the traditional customer base. And what I mean by that is the overall country's development depends on it. Okay? If you're looking at adding new industries or manufacturing sectors to the nation, the inability to produce power becomes a detractor. Okay? Because no investor from where the United States, England, or whatever would have the desire really to bring his own generating capacity into the country. He said, okay, you want to open up a new manufacturing. Take for example, timber. The country has more trees than people. Okay, so stands to reason that the timber or lumber industry would be a good place to look in terms of expanding the manufacturing sector, in terms of adding value add to any process or procedure. And we do not have today an adequate ability to supply treated wood out of Guyana. We can supply raw wood, meaning you chop the trees down, you put it in a container, and you ship it out. Okay? Treated wood would be in a category of treating the wood to adapt it to various environments around the world. Treating the wood would be making finished product, moldings and things of that nature that can be shipped around the world. Okay, but with that effort, we require a stable amount of energy to do that, to encourage investors to come in and invest in that element. In Guyana, we have more sand than we can and we can adequately do things with. Okay, we can make glass in Guyana. Okay, but again, a glass factory requires an enormous amount of power to do it. So this thing about the uneasiness about the customers that are experiencing the blackouts extends way beyond that immediate need for light for your everyday use. It also affects the country's development as a whole.
Mr. Welch, I must thank you very much for coming on. When I did ask you to come on the program, I did not expect to get these clear, concise, and practical answers. You have done a marvelous job tonight to let our listeners, those who are suffering from power blackouts, know what's going on. And it's fantastic to hear your explanations tonight. I'm really, really, really and truly pleased with your answers.
Okay.
So thanks to you once again. And next Monday, about your listeners, tune in to Globespan at 7:30 to hear about the problems of mental health. We will be having 3 experts to talk about it and how to find solutions to mental health in Guyana. So Mr. Welch, thank you very much. Thanks to all our sponsors, and thanks to Noor Singh for making this program available, and to Devin Bissoon and Ryan Gobin as well, our technical directors. But most importantly, thanks to all our listeners. You have done a wonderful job. You have sent me a number of questions, but I can only ask so many questions.
Okay.
I will have to bring Mr. Welch back at another time, and you'll get a chance to hear him again.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks.
It's my